Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Spring Pathways to Prosperity Network Institute. We wish we were with you in person in Houston right now, but we're really glad that we're able to offer these virtual sessions. And I wanted to introduce our two colleagues, Leah Moschella and Nicole Johnson, are going to be helping us monitor the chat and respond to your questions in real time, pause and alert us if there are issues that we want to address in real time as well. And so Leah and Nicole, I don't know if you want to say hello to everyone.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks so much, Nicole. And you have the ability to unmute yourself. You're going to be muted upon entry, but you can unmute yourself. And please, if you step away from your desk or I'm assuming we're all working from home. Sometimes if you put us on hold, we get hold music. So if that's the case wherever you happen to be, please don't do that. And if you are a tweeter, we'd love for you to tweet at us. So here are our Twitter handles. But we wanted to really gather together and talk about how the future is now. Like, even 3 weeks ago, the way that we were planning for this institute is very different than where we are today with respect to COVID-19. And so we wanted to open up this plenary to think about implications related to the coronavirus pandemic and also kind of reground us in who we are and what we're doing as a network. So I wanted to start with saying a little bit about JFF. So JFF is our home organization. You may know us as Jobs for the Future. We're a national nonprofit, and our work is squarely in the space that we are all living into right now with respect to needing to re-envision and transform the American workforce and education systems with the lens on equity so that all can experience economic advancement. And we know that with unprecedented unemployment claims, with the challenges that we're facing in our economy today, like this work is even more critical than ever. So JFF is proud to be a partner to you and to the field in thinking about how we can respond to the crisis and also lead into the future to support people. By the numbers, I mentioned that we're a national nonprofit organization. We've worked almost across the entire country, doing projects related to education, workforce development, economic development, public policy. We have 3 offices. Our main office is in Boston. We have another office in Oakland, another in Washington, D.C., and we have a number of remote staff, such as myself. I'm calling in from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And we're really fortunate to be able to have the national perspective into state level, regional level, and local level practices and innovations, and also challenges. So I see, our value add is helping to design innovations that work, scale those innovations across the field, support and advocate for policy, help to direct investments and funding, and really share the best practices that you're leading and learning from with others. So the who we are and the what we are is really all because of the why. This is our slide of why JFF exists. Like, we care about economic mobility and we see that it's out of reach for millions. And this is data from prior to COVID-19. And we think about closing the skills and equity gaps in all of our work. So we worry about the millions of low-income young people who are not in school and not working, often known as opportunity youth. We worry about the workers that don't have a post-secondary credential or the adults that don't have a high school diploma. We worry about the decline of the American dream and how young people today are not out earning their parents, or the decrease in share of the national income held by middle class households. So these are some data points that have really helped us ground why we do our work. We want to make sure that everyone in our country has access to meaningful employment, powerful educational opportunities that allow them to set visions for their lives and achieve their own goals. So why we are here today as a network, the body of work that we've been leading within the broader JFF context has been the Pathways to Prosperity Network, and you are all our valued partners and members and leaders in this space. And how we situate our work within Pathways to Prosperity is that we're really boldly reimagining how our education and workforce systems meet talent needs and prepare young people. And today we're going to push on the premise of young people a little bit and think about adults as well for careers. And so I will lead us into thinking a little bit about how we've been learning about our best practices in the field from coast to coast in our Pathways network. And this map shows, the green slides or the green states are states that are either current or former members in some capacity. The circles are states in which we've had some Pathways related work, but not necessarily through the network. So I just wanted you to see that the work that you're leaning into in this space with respect to college and career pathways, with respect to talent pipeline development, with respect to connecting education, workforce development, and economic development, is a national movement that is uniquely bipartisan right now. And if anything, we need to rally around this vision for pathways now more than ever. So it's no surprise that there are new issues emerging related to COVID-19 and the crisis that we're facing. And what has really been evident for us is the fundamental mismatch of our current institutions and systems for the future of learning and work. So at JFF, we've given for years a presentation called The Future of Work, and we talk through all the data related to trends in the future of work about AI and the robotic apocalypse and the changing nature of work and the gig economy and the accelerated pace of technology and all the data there. But the future is right now. And we're seeing in stark relief the inequities that this is causing, but we're also seeing some really creative solutions about how our education and workforce systems are adapting right now to respond to this crisis. And we're thinking about how might they need to transform to more equitably meet the needs of our people, our communities, and our economies in the long term. So what we think about this is that our work together, not just JFF's work, but our work as a community in the Pathways to Prosperity Network is more important than ever. So we're thinking about preparing people for the future of work, which frankly right now is a real challenge that we're going to have to tackle collectively. We're thinking about equity and economic advancement, and we worry that this crisis is only going to exacerbate by deepening and widening the inequities in access to opportunity and in life outcomes. And then we think about meeting employer needs, and employers are struggling now more than ever as we're thinking about the changing needs of the workforce with relation to COVID right now. This is a quotation from our president and CEO, Maria Flynn, which really resonated with us. She wrote a great piece about some of the challenges in this crisis and a call to action for government and business and industry and all of us to step up and respond. What we do right now is a measure of our commitment, compassion, and humanity. But ultimately, what we're doing now will define what the future will look like. And it's a good thing to keep in mind that this is both near term, like we've got to figure stuff out because things need our attention immediately, but let's not forget about the midterm and the long-term implications of our decisions. And in this piece, we talk about, as I mentioned, the magnification of economic inequality. And we're really thinking about how do we support the most vulnerable individuals and their families and do so through systems building of an interrelated web of aid that thinks about multiple facets of people's needs during this time. So things like income support, as we're seeing, but healthcare, childcare, food and housing security, and then looking beyond immediate emergency and thinking about like reinvention of our systems as a result. And wanted to share some of the questions that we're asking at JFF in relationship to our work. So what we want to think through with you is how do we transform the Pathways to Prosperity Network work, but our work overall to think about things in new and different ways. So when I think about hiring for skills, not credentials, like 3 weeks ago, we were in the tightest labor market that we've had in 50 years. And all of a sudden, like the world is turned upside down and we confront the possibility of up to 20% unemployment. And we know that like millions of laid off workers are looking for jobs. And the research shows that more than 70 million of these workers will have in-demand skills and experiences, but don't have the degrees or formal credentials that are often what are on hiring managers' job descriptions. So how do we accelerate connections of people to the workforce with considerations of skills-based hiring instead of credential-based hiring? And we do some work with a colleague at Harvard Business School, Joe Fuller, who does terrific research on the return on investment for employers to shift to skills-based hiring and to look into the sub-baccalaureate space. He has a great paper called Dismissed by Degrees that speaks to this that I'd recommend taking a look at if you're interested. On opening the door to new training providers, like because we're headed into a recession, education investments tend to be countercyclical and people will be coming back in mass to our community colleges, to our four-year institutions, to any education and training provider now, because they're going to be needing to upskill or reskill during this recession. But we know our systems are not going to be sufficient to meet everybody's needs, and we're going to need to open the doors of possibility even wider. So we're thinking about like, how do we welcome into building pathways, boot camps and online training providers and other innovations that have largely been outside of systems and on the fringe, but now can play more of a core role in partnering with our systems to meet the needs of people. And then on embracing new financing models, we think about displaced workers often lacking the startup capital to invest in themselves. Like as we have lots of people out of work, lots of students struggling to see a vision for themselves in the future, like how can we think about pay for success or performance-based approaches to funding education and training? with a lens on equity and protecting people. And then finally, like leveraging tech for new ways of learning and working. Like we're not maximizing the potential of technology. Like Kyle and I were talking, I think it was earlier today, or maybe it was yesterday, about how our children are essentially doing worksheets online. And that's their way of leveraging technology by doing distance learning, or they're recreating classroom settings online, but we're not really transforming how our learning takes place from a new approach to pedagogy. And also thinking about things like work-based learning. So our employers right now are struggling to stay afloat. How do we use things like virtual and augmented reality or other tech platforms for us to think about how we might support work-based learning in new ways? Because what does real-world hands-on learning mean when we are socially distant from one another and can't actually engage in real-world settings? So those are the things that we're thinking about. And I just wanted to throw this slide up too and share that we've been looking to what our partner nonprofit organizations and think tanks in the country are thinking about. This was a piece of data that I found really interesting that unpacked from Brookings the high risk industries. So mining and oil and gas, transportation, employment services, travel, leisure and hospitality. But you can see in some areas of our nation, like we're looking at to 25 to 42% likely job loss because of these high risk industries that will not be sustained in the short term. And so we're really looking at, what do we need to do about rethinking our industry sector approach and sector strategies altogether? And as an organization, if you're interested in digging more into some of the federal responses, we have a great federal policy team, and they've put together a summary of all the different acts as they've come out, which you can find online and may be interesting and useful for you as you're doing your state and regional planning in response to COVID. Kyle, I'm going to pass it over to you to talk through the Pathways Network, and I will chime in accordingly as I see fit.
Absolutely. Thanks, Amy. Hi, everybody. It's great to see some of your faces and certainly see and hear your voice through these virtual mechanisms. As Amy introduced at the beginning, we're here through the lens of this institute to really bring together this national network. And as Amy was talking about before, the darker green as opposed to the minty green are states or regions that are currently members of the network. The mint green are folks who have been historically as a part of this conversation. And then all of these circles represent adjacent bodies of work where we see work informing what happens across our network, but also the way that our network informs broader work and scale and action in the field. And Amy talked earlier too about, this is not it's not a red state or a blue state network. Like we're really coming together across states and regions and cities at this point. So when we think about our network, we're really thinking along two domains. And we think about the possibility and the nature of impact, as well as knowledge and knowledge creation. And so if you look on the left side of this diagram, there's sort of like two levels of impact that we think about and that we think about the value of our network. So there's impact at the individual level. Like, so as members of this network, like how are you adapting and identifying what you need to do in your local context and really holding constant the local and immediate needs of your communities? And that this network then bringing resources to bear to support individual members at different levels of the system. But because we're coming together, we also have this really strong opportunity to have collective impact as we think about that way that we're coordinating and leveraging the collected body of knowledge and skills and competencies that you have as members to bring best practices to scale. And that ultimately another output for us as we think about the network is learning and innovation. Like how do we actually not just do more work, but how do we really innovate and learn constantly as we engage in this work so that things can change over time? And that the other domain and value as we think about this network is the way that we think about knowledge and the sharing of existing knowledge as we make local adaptations and translate things into practice and coordinate across contexts. But that also, how do we collectively produce new knowledge actually starts to change the national dialogue around what is possible here. That actually starts to change the narrative that people, not just practitioners hold, but students and families and community members hold about what is possible when we come together around big, bold action. And so as we think about the work of the network, we are thinking about focusing on transformative outcomes. And now more than ever, we see this coming into full transparency as we think about wanting every student, young person to have clear college and career goals and the supports that they need to achieve them. How do we make sure that employers have a pipeline of young, talented professionals skills that they need to enter, to develop in, and to eventually lead the workforce across a new horizon line? How do we think about the needs of communities and to ensure that they're welcoming places for new business and industry and opportunities to grow new ideas in the fertile ground that are the communities that we are a part of? And that ultimately we are thinking, and we need to think about the economy. And these are both regional and state economies. And how do we, at this point in time, think ahead now and scenario plan about how do we make sure that our economies can thrive and grow and ultimately provide opportunities for upward mobility and economic advancement for all of our citizens? Amy, if you can go ahead and move to the next slide. So one of the challenges that we have is historically, this is how the world has operated. And so if you kind of look at the picture here, and there's a man sort of balding in a business suit, sort of pointing his finger back at the college president and, talking about how they just need better educated workers and that everything would be fine in business and industry. And then the college president pointing over to the high school principal talking about how we need better high school grads and why can't they just do a better job of making sure all kids are ready for college, and the high school pointing back to middle school and saying kids are coming to us so underprepared and we're needing to remediate and this is all your fault, and all the way back into kindergarten and prenatal care, right? So everyone is kicking the can around and no one is taking or owning responsibility for actually making a change or a difference in what is possible. And so what we really need is for folks to stop pointing their finger at each other and start pointing their finger and putting something really clear in the center that they can all commonly gather around and motivate around. So, one of the ways to think about this is how do we put the thing that we care most about? And in this instance, we put equitable economic advancement for all in the center here. And so rather than putting one of these entities or one of these organizations in the center, how do we really think about bringing people around with a focus on a clear strategic mission and goal that everyone can get behind? And as we've seen over time across this network, that the problems that people most often identify as those that they need to solve are only solvable by collective action. And they need one another. All of these different entities need one another to actually advance on big, bold, and transformative goals, especially as we think about a recovery that is still a little bit opaque in terms of what that's going to look like. And so this is a really opportune time to continue to look to and examine and think about the levers and the strategies that we have for implementation as we think about building ecosystems of college and career pathways. How do we make sure that we're really forging and nurturing relationships and strong partnerships across education and industry? How do we make sure that we're building systems for work-based learning? And I know that people are scrambling all across the country right now to think about how do they maintain momentum. And I saw this in the Strand on Poll Everywhere about losing momentum on some of these things. But I know that even I was on a call today with some folks in New York City, and they're thinking about how do we, very quickly mobilize toward action to engage in virtual context to support the ongoing opportunity for work-based learning through this crisis, as they think about, a huge, thousands of students in CT high schools. How do we think differently about who we are as leaders and the role of leadership in leading this work? And so not just leading within institutions, but leading across, and what that really means, and and not always the positional role of leadership, but the functional role of leadership, especially as we think about cross-sector, and the role and function of policy and advocacy, both big P policy as we think about statute and legislation, but also the policies that govern and guide the way we operate within institutions or across our partnerships. How do we make sure that we're really thinking about career information and advising at scale, and making sure that this is happening in iterative and ongoing ways over time with young people, reaching as far back as middle school, if not earlier. And I'm thinking right now about young people and the access that they might have to start these conversations now at home as they're thinking about what their possible futures might look like. And also then the really critical need to better align secondary and post-secondary and integrate them ultimately. That it's not just about making sure that students know how to get from K-12 into the post-secondary system, but how are those systems and institutions really partnered so that it's a seamless transition from one to the other with really clear signals across the board. So we're going to keep moving. So what does this wind up with, right? We have a narrative that helps us move from the left side of this diagram with a clear, rigorous academic structure and through career-focused learning, all the way up into changed and transformed outcomes. But what we're trying to capture here is this opportunity for on-ramps and off-ramps, stackable credentials all the way through, with an increased potential to move up and through a career ladder. Now, the trick to the system, of course, is also that it needs to be designed in reverse. That we can't just design it forward. We need to actually design it from the employer side, from the industry side, back into post-secondary and into the K-12 system. And one of the reasons for this is, historically, the old economy sort of told a story that we would go to school and we would learn some stuff and we would get a job and maybe we would get a promotion and one day we would eventually retire and sort of wane and maybe sit in a rocking chair drinking a cup of sweet tea if we were lucky. But the new economy has really changed that narrative. And as we think about moving through the current crisis right now, how do we actually build systems that account for this back and forth and consistent need to learn, relearn, unlearn, engage in employment, come back and learn new skills to completely and in ongoing ways recondition who we are in relation to work? With expectations that young people today are going to have north of 15, possibly up to 20 jobs across multiple industry sectors over their lifetime. And so this is really about the utter and complete redesign of the way our systems work. And Amy was alluding to that fact before about, digital worksheets. And so, this is not going to cut it as we think about redesigning what education needs to look like.
And one thing to note is like this also tells me that education is not just about young people. Like this is all of us and all adults in all walks of life in all settings. Like we are all going to need to be learning and unlearning and relearning and engaging in new ways in the workforce. And so as we're thinking about pathways, we're now thinking much more broadly about like what is the purpose of a pathway and who is it serving?
Which is a great setup for this piece of the conversation. I think that this is exactly what Amy is alluding to is, at this moment in time, historically, this network has traditionally focused on in-school youth, and that work is critically important now, as it always has been. But how do we take this opportunity to really push harder on fundamentally transforming the systems that we have so that they're not just thinking about youth, but, casting a much broader net and thinking more deeply about young adults and adults as they're moving through systems of education and workforce training across their lifetime. Because this is not just about entering the workforce, it's not just about launching a career. For many people, it's about re-entering and re-engaging in new ways and being able to realize their best possible futures, not just for young people, but throughout their adult lives. And so part of this bold vision, then how do we together, sort of thinking about this a little bit like a call to action, like if we can get this right, we have a chance to make sure that demography and historical performance in systems is not the destiny of any individual. That together we can actually create systems that have really clear signals and on-ramps and off-ramps about what to do, when to do it, where to go, how do you get from here to here across your lifetime to be able to access the education and training that you need to obtain credentials with value in the labor market. How do we make sure that they're driven by labor markets as we move through this recession and beyond? And that ultimately, and this goes back to the career information and advising piece, is how do we make sure that people all across life spectrum have access to the type of information and experiences and credentials that ultimately allow them to engage in meaningful careers over time and find meaning and dignity and value in their working selves. So this is going to require us to change sometimes the way we think about this. And our network has done amazing work partnering across systems and institutions to design really strong ecosystems. And so as we think about the pitching a bigger tent, well, what does that mean? It means actually widening the aperture a little bit if we want to take in and think about different populations. And so how do we build upon the good work that folks across this network has already done and think continuously and more deeply about how do we welcome others to this conversation at the design phase, and also it never being too late to welcome the voices of folks who are working with and thinking about serving opportunity youth as we think about re-entry and justice and system-involved youth and adults, as we think about veteran populations, as we think about people with disabilities, tribal communities, people in rural areas, people of color, immigrants. How do we make sure that we have enough voices at the table to make sure that we're not, one, inadvertently designing systems that will not be equitable in terms of their access, but also that we don't wind up creating too many different systems running in parallel, in that all of these different population subgroups need access to credentials with value in the labor market. So how do we get this right? And ultimately, how do we keep a real laser-like focus on equity as we do so? And this is a common theme right now, I think, in our public discourse and in this narrative here today, but it's really about our relationships and ultimately our humanity that matters now more than ever. We've seen the data on automation, and those that are least likely for automation are those that require the sort of the things that make us uniquely and distinctly human. How do we leverage those talents and that we all inherently possess to think not just about how do we enter the labor market of today with that, but help to shape a narrative about what the labor market of the future can look like, built upon the capacity of what makes us uniquely human. How do we rely on families and networks and the communities to provide the support that all people need in terms of sort of wraparound services? And ultimately, how do we reconsider the interdependence of work across sectors? I think we're seeing, as infrastructure has really unraveled very quickly, we see how interdependent so many of these sectors are in ways I think that maybe we've kind of known, but not directly addressed or looked at as we design systems that try to help people move to and through opportunities for learning and employment. So, go ahead.
I was going to say a quick note here is like, as we're serving people, like these people are people situated in families and in communities and in context of networks. And so we're really thinking about like, what does it mean for our work to ultimately build pathways that are supporting multiple generations that are impacted by COVID-19? And so this is very people-centric, personally, professionally, community-based. Like, this is why this work matters and why collaboration matters.
So as we think about this bigger tent and this idea of it's not just collaboration for collaboration's sake, and it's also asking us to really rethink, it's not just about the outcomes or the outputs of these systems, but ultimately the long-term impact. And we've talked a little bit about improving the transitions between systems. We've talked a little bit about alignment between education and workforce and signaling and on-ramps and off-ramps. But two other critical points as we think about the results of collaboration that can yield stronger impact is how do we intentionally work to break down those structural and policy barriers that get in the way of doing the type of high quality career focused learning that we know matters most. And that ultimately, how do we then build these systems so that they establish and support the creation of experiences for people that open doors to, we'll call them new networks and forms of social capital and financial capital. And that's so it's not just about, the educational side of this, but the whole experiential side, the effective domain essentially of these systems. It can't just be the technical design piece, but how do we really think about how people experience these systems at every moment of time? How conscious are they of what they're moving through? Are they conscious of the access that they're gaining to different types of network in these types of capital? And so we have work to do in that regard, but that's also really exciting work that we're looking forward to engaging with you on over time. The truth of the matter here, though, is collaboration is really hard, and we know that there are challenges with this, and we think about the complexity that we have to navigate with that. And so, trust moves at the not trust moves at the speed of relationships move at the speed of trust. Thank you. And so like we have to take the time to nurture those relationships, and we have to build trust in and among our partners, so that we can actually move the needle on the things that matter for us. Sometimes we're not always in a position of formal authority, especially when we're working in cross-sector contexts. And so how do we exert influence and advocate for the right things at the right time with the right people, and keep a targeted eye on the commitments that we have to make sure that we can move forward? And that ultimately, we're looking at right now as leaders, how do we provide continuity in the midst of change and uncertainty? And especially in the face of something that's very opaque right now. So how do we keep and hold a vision and keep that work alive, knowing that there are real impacts in our day-to-day lives in that human level? And how do we make sure that we don't let go of the fact that we need to keep doing this? I was on the phone yesterday with a community college president, and was talking like, how do we make sure we don't waste this crisis in a very real and honest way, that this is a real opportunity for us to make sure that we can, have a narrative that helps carry people through the uncertainty that we're all faced with. And so how do we lean into that in really clear and powerful ways, and ultimately together? In the last few minutes here, we just wanted to say a couple final points. We've shared some of this with our network. I think during a larger session, I think in Arizona was the last time we talked about this at scale. But as we think about this opportunity we have for essentially reimagining the type of collaboration that we need to engage in, continuously reminded of the 4 network mindset principles by Janeway Skillen. She talks about these 4 big ideas that we want to walk you through really quickly here. Just as a way to sort of set a little bit of a tone about the challenges that are in front of us, but also the opportunity. And so one of the things that she talks about in her work and research is this idea of focusing on the mission, not the organization, and that to advance the mission, as leaders, we need to adopt the strategies and tactics to help us focus on that thing. And if you remember back to the stakeholder map with everybody around the perimeter with equitable economic advancement in the center, like this is a great example of that. And if this is the thing that we care about and we want to move the needle on, we need to make sure that we're putting ourselves on the outside of that, and that keeping a really crystal clear focus on the mission that we want to achieve. I think the next one is equally as critical as we think about this idea of trust and not control, knowing that the problems that we face are too big for any one entity or any one organization or any one perspective to solve, and that only together can we actually, and through trusting that our community collectively will catch us when we fall, but that ultimately that only together can we actually do the thing that we want to achieve, and that we can't overly push on the formal mechanisms, and really have to trust that the informal sequencing and opportunities that exist in the networks are the thing that will carry us through. Humility, not brand. This is, I think, a really challenging one to ultimately lean into is, how do we make sure that we focus and welcome our peers and our partners as equals into this work? And I recognize like JFF has a brand. All of our organizations have a brand, and we have our own unique mission and vision and goals, and we work in those organizations and with those agencies and in our systems for particular reasons. And this doesn't mean to let go of why we love where we work, for instance, but it's about making sure that what we focus on welcomes other people into the conversation at a really broad level, and that we don't keep ourselves at the center. And that finally, the last point here, and this speaks to this idea of the node, not hub, right? We're individually part of a larger web of activity, ultimately focused on this bigger outcome. And these are really challenging propositions, and I don't think that they're easy to think about. It's hard to change the way we work in these contexts. I think they're operating at multiple levels. Like within an organization, it doesn't necessarily work. It's really thinking about our inter-organizational context and the way that we partner across institutions and agencies, and in really big, bold stakeholder engagements. And so just putting these back on the table for us to consider as we think about the types of collaboration we're going to need coming up very quickly as we think about recovery from our current conditions.
And I would say that in light of COVID-19, like we're going to probably see people having a zero-sum mindset about things like funding. Nonprofits are in peril. Community-based organizations and their sustainability are, on the table. Employer sustainability is on the table. And so when we think about these 4 kind of calls to action with respect to reinventing our relationships, like these are tough asks. But this dual transformation slide is something that we use often in our JFF meetings, because it's something that our president and CEO has really helped us think about in our work, even prior to the pandemic crisis, that we both are working within existing systems and we're pushing on new innovations outside of the system. So we're thinking about how do we improve and reposition today, and how do we create tomorrow to ensure that we're really leveraging our core assets and living into the possibility of the promise of pathways and of the work that JFF leads in general. Kyle, do you want to say a little bit about dual transformation?
No, the only thing I'd add is, thinking about this really taking stock of assets we have collectively as a broader network and community, and there's so many resources in the field. and that, you know, leaning into the fact that we can't do one or the other of these too much. Like, we can't overly rely on the past. We can't redesign for the future. That really holding constant, that we can be focusing on both, is really critical. And I think that we'll make sure that we share this back out, and we can bring this back as a topic back to the network, because I think that this is also it's challenging work to engage in, but I think worth a broader conversation across the network about how we can collectively do this and really take stock of how do we create this tomorrow by bringing to bear the things that we know about, but also then clearly identifying the things we need to learn about and get better at together.
We're doing some work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on building equitable pathways and really leveraging the role and the power of intermediaries to be ecosystem designers and sustainers of systems for pathways. And a woman at the foundation has been doing some research around youth occupational identity. And this was a quotation that really jumped out at us that I think is relevant for youth and adults alike, is that I think we've been so conditioned to asking our children, like, what are you going to be when you grow up? Or, you know, what are you interested in for a career? And really right now, this moment is demanding of us to think about, like, what do we want our lives to be like in the future? And so it's shifting the technicality of zooming in on an occupation or an industry sector and really thinking about the broader contextual needs of young people and adults alike. A subtle shift, but a significant shift in mindsets when we're thinking about designing pathways. Kyle, this is all you.
So just a final word here before we just quickly preview the virtual sessions that we're going to hold today and then again tomorrow. I don't know if other people are fans of Tolkien. I've had the privilege of reading this to my kids recently, so it's as close as I could get to reading it for the first time. And this particular passage really struck me as I think about our current context and situation. And this is sort of towards the beginning of the story, and the most unlikely of candidates steps forward to take on the greatest of burdens. Context of that story, of course, but you know, this idea that you know, no one chooses to live in the times that we live in, but what we do have choice in, you know, is how we decide what to do with the time in which we have, and the ways that we act and show up. And I think that this goes back to what Maria was talking about and some of the points that Amy has leaned in here. And so how do we become a beacon and a lighthouse for the communities and the regions and the states that we serve and that we care about, and sort of how do we collectively ask these questions together so that we can move to the other side of this with a really clear way of helping move us through.
Thank you for joining this opening plenary. We really wanted to set a big stage around the context of where we are with COVID-19, around why we need these bigger cross-sector partnerships, and to think differently about pathways, about not just in-school youth, but also out-of-school youth, also adults, also incarcerated populations, also, you know, anyone and everyone who needs to gain a foothold in today's economy. So we really appreciate you joining us for this. We know it was a lot of talking, but we really encourage you to jump in on the breakout sessions, which will be super powerful and engaging. And please reach out to either one of us or any of us at JFF if you have any other questions.
Thanks so much.
Else, Kyle?
No, just a great appreciation for this community, and thank you for joining, and looking forward to continuing this conversation. We have a lot to learn and a lot of work to do.
All right, everyone. Thank you. We'll see you soon.